After almost 3 months of negotiation, the government's finally signed its asylum seeker swap deal with Malaysia. Critics of the agreement say it's light on detail, and they remain suspicious about the assurances on human rights it contains. And the government's been forced into a back-down over the fate of the 500 asylum seekers who arrived in Australia while the agreement was being negotiated. Political correspondent Tom Eagleton reports from Canberra.
Access denied. The government wants to lock people smugglers out of Australia.
We'll just get ourselves let in.
And the Malaysia deal's a key part of ending what's become a major political headache.
This is a tough measure, but we have worked hard to ensure that there are appropriate protections in place on human rights.
800 asylum seekers are to be transferred to Malaysia. Once there, they'll be detained for a month and a half before getting access to the right to work and basic health and education services.
That means they will not be subject to any of the penalties imposed on illegal entrants. This means they will not be arrested and they will not be caned.
The government says news of the Malaysia deal has already had an impact on people smuggling networks, and it's launching a worldwide information campaign to reinforce the point.
This is a win for Malaysia, a win for Australia, and a loss for the people smugglers.
Behind the scenes, the opposition agrees the government's approach might work in the long term. But arriving by boat himself today, Tony Abbott's accusing Julia Gillard of double standards.
If the Howard government had done something like this, every human rights activist in the country would be in uproar. And now a Labor government, which has previously denounced as inhumane the kind of policies that the Howard government put in place, is doing something far, far more brutal.
Suspicion remains across the political divide over the ability to follow through on the human rights assurances contained in the deal.
The details should have been in the agreement. I think verbal assurances mean nothing in this circumstance.
I'm not sharing the assumption that both nations to this agreement won't honour the obligations that they freely entered into.
The human rights protections simply aren't there. The UNHCR, I note, is not a signatory to this agreement.
The UNHCR will join an oversight committee with representatives of both governments to monitor the implementation of the deal, but asylum seeker advocates aren't convinced.
We know very little about what resources are going to be dedicated to ensuring that this agreement is properly implemented in the context of a country that has a very poor track record in relation to the treatment of refugees.
The Prime Minister reiterated today there will be no blanket exemptions for transferal, though there'll be special care provided for vulnerable people once they're in Malaysia.
There remain really serious concerns about the fate of vulnerable people, such as women and children, under this agreement.
That aspect has many in Labor feeling uncomfortable with the deal. The opposition, meanwhile, accuses the Prime Minister of making policy on the run, a charge made all the more credible by a backflip on the fate of 500 or so asylum seekers who've arrived in the 3 months that it's taken to negotiate the deal with Malaysia. First, they were going to be processed offshore. Now they'll be processed here after all.
But they've been forced to back down, and having backed down, they should admit to the Australian people that they misled them.
It is high time that those cases be processed as soon as possible, because every day is another day of damage to those detained in those circumstances.
And another day of potential damage for the government. Tom Eagleton, Late Line.